Episode 28, Atlantic Revolutions and the American Revolution, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. Hey everyone, welcome back. Finals are coming up, winter break is getting close, and honestly I feel like Europe is also kind of hitting the end of semester meltdown point right now.
That is actually a pretty fair comparison, Miles. By the late 18th century, a lot of European governments were under enormous pressure financially and politically.
Which sounds familiar because I also feel under enormous pressure financially and politically every time I look at my AP Euro review packet.
The difference, Miles, is that your review packet probably will not lead to revolution.
Hopefully.
Today
we're starting our unit on the Atlantic Revolutions and the political upheavals that transformed the late 18th century. But before we get into the French Revolution next episode, we're starting with the broader Atlantic world and the American Revolution.
And that broader Atlantic context is really important. The American Revolution wasn't just an isolated colonial rebellion. It was part of a much larger crisis spreading across Europe and the Atlantic world.
ideas, goods, people, and political frustrations were all moving back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean during the 18th century.
Which honestly makes more sense for AP European history, because otherwise it kind of feels weird to suddenly spend a whole episode talking about the United States.
Exactly. What matters here is how the American Revolution emerged from European conflicts and how it influenced later revolutions in France and beyond.
So where does this revolutionary story really begin?
It begins with major social and economic changes in the 18th century. Europe was becoming wealthier overall because of trade, overseas colonies, and expanding markets.
But that wealth was distributed unevenly. Investors and merchants connected to overseas commerce often became very rich, while poorer Europeans struggled with rising prices.
So kind of like economic growth that still leaves a lot of people frustrated.
Precisely. We also see the growth of the bourgeoisie, meaning wealthy middle-class merchants, professionals, and officials.
The traditional line between noble and commoner started to blur. Wealthy commoners bought land and titles, while nobles invested in trade and business ventures.
So the old social order starts getting messy.
Very messy. If wealthy commoners could become socially powerful, then people naturally started questioning why inherited privilege should exist at all.
And that sounds dangerous for monarchies.
It was, especially because these economic changes were happening at the same time Enlightenment ideas were spreading.
Another major contradiction shaping the Atlantic world was slavery.
Yeah, I noticed that section.
European colonies in the Americas depended heavily on enslaved labor, especially plantation colonies producing sugar and other cash crops.
Colonial governments created strict racial systems to justify and enforce slavery. Europeans and people of European descent occupied the highest social position, while enslaved Africans occupied the lowest.
And even free people of color still faced legal restrictions.
Correct. In many colonies, free people of color faced restrictions on property ownership, marriage, and even clothing.
Which makes the Enlightenment stuff sound kind of hypocritical.
Many people at the time noticed that contradiction too.
Especially enslaved people and free people of color living in the colonies.
So while Europeans are talking about liberty and equality, they're also running plantation economies built on slavery.
Exactly.
That feels like one of the biggest contradictions of the entire revolutionary era.
It is one of the defining contradictions of the Revolutionary era.
So what exactly did people mean by liberty and equality during the Enlightenment?
Liberty mainly referred to individual rights. Enlightenment liberals argued that people should have freedom of worship, freedom from censorship, and protection from arbitrary government power.
They also believed governments should follow laws rather than simply carrying out the personal will of a monarch.
So this is directly challenging absolutism.
Very directly.
Another important idea was popular sovereignty, meaning the idea that political authority comes from the people rather than from divine right.
Which would sound pretty revolutionary if kings claimed God gave them power.
Exactly. Enlightenment thinkers argued that governments should represent the people and remain accountable to them.
Was everyone included in that idea of the people?
No. There were major limits to who was included in those ideas of equality and political participation.
Most Enlightenment liberals did not support political equality for women. Most also accepted racial hierarchy.
And they generally accepted economic inequality as natural.
So equality mostly meant equality before the law for certain groups of men.
That is a much more accurate way to think about it.
Still, Even with those limits, these ideas would seem radical in a Europe dominated by monarchies and aristocrats.
They absolutely were,
So then everything escalates with the 7 Years' War.
which is one of the most important conflicts of the 18th century.
This is basically the first global war, right?
Many historians describe it that way. Fighting stretched from Central Europe to North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, India, and the Philippines.
In North America, colonists called it the French and Indian War.
I remember that from U.S. history.
Britain and Prussia fought against France, Austria, and eventually Spain. By the end of the war in 1763, Britain had gained enormous territory and emerged as the dominant imperial power.
So Britain won big.
Yes, but victory came at a tremendous cost.
This is the part I never really understood before. How does winning a war bankrupt you?
Wars are extremely expensive. Governments borrowed heavily to pay soldiers, maintain navies, transport supplies, and finance military campaigns around the world.
And 18th century states did not have unlimited financial resources.
Britain emerged with a massive national debt. France also faced severe financial problems.
So governments start looking for ways to raise more money.
Exactly.
This became one of the major causes of the Revolutionary Era. Governments needed higher taxes, but people increasingly resisted taxation and questioned political authority.
And Britain decides the colonies should help pay for imperial defense,
Correct.
which leads into the American Revolution.
Before independence, most colonists still considered themselves loyal British subjects.
So at first they weren't trying to create a new country?
No. Initially, many colonists simply wanted what they considered their traditional rights as English subjects.
Britain passed new taxes like the Stamp Act and strengthened customs enforcement.
And colonists responded with protests and boycotts.
Correct. Colonial resistance intensified during the 1760s and 1770s.
Parliament also passed the Tea Act, which eventually contributed to the Boston Tea Party.
Which then leads to the Coercive Acts.
Exactly. The British government wanted to reassert authority over the colonies.
But instead it escalated the crisis.
Very much so.
The First Continental Congress happens after that, right?
Yes, colonial representatives gathered to coordinate resistance and petition the British Crown.
But fighting breaks out at Lexington and Concord in 1775.
Once armed conflict began, compromise became far more difficult.
Thomas Paine's Common Sense also becomes important around this point.
An enormously influential pamphlet.
Why was it such a big deal?
Paine argued very directly that monarchy itself was illegitimate and that independence made sense politically and morally.
He wrote in accessible language aimed at ordinary readers, not just elites.
So Enlightenment political ideas are becoming mass politics.
Exactly.
Then comes the Declaration of Independence.
Adopted on July 4th, 1776.
How much of that document is influenced by Enlightenment ideas?
A great deal. Thomas Jefferson drew heavily from John Locke.
Natural rights?
Yes. Locke argued that people possess natural rights and that governments exist to protect those rights.
And if governments violate those rights, citizens possess the right to resist or overthrow them.
Which is an incredibly radical idea if you're a king.
Extremely radical.
The revolution also becomes international pretty quickly.
France strongly disliked Britain after the 7 Years' War and saw an opportunity to weaken its rival.
French volunteers, including the Marquis de Lafayette, joined the American cause.
Lafayette becomes close with George Washington, right?
Correct?
Then, in 1778, France formally allied with the Americans.
Which means Britain suddenly has a much bigger problem.
A global problem. Spain and the Dutch Republic also entered the conflict against Britain.
So Britain is basically fighting another world war.
In many ways, yes.
By 1780, Britain was effectively fighting much of Europe along with the colonies.
That sounds almost impossible to sustain.
Especially while also dealing with setbacks in India, the Caribbean, and North America.
Then Yorktown happens.
In 1781, British forces under Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown.
That defeat convinced the British government that continuing the war would be too costly.
So Britain negotiates peace.
Under the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Britain recognized American independence.
The new United States also gained a vast amount of territory, stretching to the Mississippi River.
Which is huge.
Enormous.
But winning independence still leaves the Americans with the problem of building a government.
Independence solved one problem, but created another.
How do you actually govern the new country?
Precisely. The Articles of Confederation created a weak central government,
Because Americans were scared of centralized authority after fighting Britain.
Exactly.
But the weak government struggled to regulate trade, collect taxes, and maintain stability.
So they end up writing the Constitution.
At the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787.
The Constitution created a stronger federal government while still preserving representative government.
Separation of powers, checks and balances, all that.
Correct.
The Bill of Rights was added soon afterward to protect individual liberties.
Which again sounds very influenced by Enlightenment ideas.
Very much so.
But the contradictions are still there.
Absolutely.
Slavery still exists.
Yes.
Women still can't participate politically.
Correct.
So the revolution creates a republic based on liberty while still limiting who fully counts as part of the political nation.
That tension would continue shaping Atlantic history for decades.
And probably helps explain why other revolutions happen afterward.
Exactly. The American Revolution demonstrated that Enlightenment ideas could actually overturn an established political system.
And people across Europe were paying very close attention.
Including France.
Especially France.
Which sounds like a pretty dangerous combination when France is already drowning in debt.
Very dangerous.
And that's where we're stopping today because next episode we're diving fully into the French Revolution.
Including the collapse of the old regime and the increasingly radical direction the revolution takes after 1789.
We'll also examine political violence, the reign of terror, and the instability that emerged once revolutionary ideals collided with war and internal division.
Which honestly sounds like a pretty intense way to head into winter break.
History rarely schedules itself conveniently around school calendars.
Unfortunately true, that's all for today. Thanks for listening to the Once and Future Present. Next episode, we'll follow the French Revolution as it becomes more radical and explore the political upheaval that transformed France after 1789.